Welcome back to The Gay Science, Book 5, and today we're going to talk about some very interesting and underrated sections of this book. And we're already pretty deep into it, so without further ado, let's just jump right into 356, How Things Will Become Ever More Artistic in Europe. Quote, "Even today, in our time of transition, when so many factors cease to compel men, the care to make a living still compels almost all male Europeans to adopt a particular role, their so-called occupation. A few retain the freedom, a merely apparent freedom, to choose this role for themselves. For most men, it is chosen. The result is rather strange. As they attain a more advanced age, almost all Europeans confound themselves with their role. They become the victims of their own good performance. They themselves have forgotten how much accidents, moods, and caprice disposed of them when the question of their, quote, vocation was decided, and how many other roles they might perhaps have been able to play. For now, it is too late. Considered more deeply, the role has actually become character and art, nature." End quote, and I'll interject here. We might ask first, have things changed in the present day? I would argue no, they have changed, but they've just reached a more advanced stage. The underlying dynamic that Nietzsche describes still holds, not only in the entire Western world, which expands far beyond Europe now, but I would argue perhaps in all of the weird countries, all of the quote-unquote modern neoliberal countries. So for one, Nietzsche says that so few things now have the ability to compel mankind. And this refers back to this physiological diagnosis of the state of civilization, of being in a kind of decline that could be associated with exhaustion. Another way of describing this would be in terms of nihilism. What would be a worthwhile expenditure of your will in the modern day? Well, for many people, and we have to speak in sort of brutally generalized or perhaps over-generalized terms here, for many people, the only thing that can really get them out of bed in the morning, so to speak, is the need to feed themselves and clothe themselves and house themselves. And the time that they have left over can simply be spent on recreation, simply on mere entertainment. And Nietzsche is going to mention this a bit later in the passage, but this is particularly definitive of American culture, where people begin to associate themselves, therefore, with their work, where it becomes, that's sort of one of the stereotypes about Americans that apparently is off-putting to some Europeans, but is perhaps more honest about the situation today. When people, introduce themselves in America, one of the first questions that comes up is, what do you do? Right? Even that question, what do you do? What kind of, which is, that means in America, what do you do for work? It's assumed that the relevant category of action or doing, the way in which your will is expressed in the world, is the way in which you contribute to society economically through your occupation or indeed your vocation, which means your calling. And there was a time when the term vocation indicated, you were being called from God. And yet Nietzsche puts this term in scare quotes. Why is that? Well, because there's so much that is accidental that goes into what kind of role you take on, what kind of occupation you are going to serve in. All sorts of, that whole tapestry of fate, random experiences, your background, where you grew up, what sort of jobs are available to you, and so on. And especially if we take a more explicitly deterministic view, perhaps germane to Nietzsche's early period, although he still holds these views as a more perhaps exoteric teaching. There is a more esoteric understanding of Nietzsche's views of determinism and free will, which we've talked about elsewhere. But nevertheless, you could even say that the individual, even when he quote-unquote chooses his vocation for himself, is nevertheless bound to those elements of his personality which he did not choose. A man does not choose what he wills, but he does will what he wills, to crib from Schopenhauer there. And so we have this situation in modern life where, afflicted by nihilism or by exhaustion of the will, however we want to phrase it, people just sort of accidentally find themselves in an occupation, and then that becomes, as Nietzsche says, a kind of strange result associated with their entire personality, because it's in some way the only place in which they feel compelled to exercise their will, the only place in which they're actually active in doing something. And yet it's not something that is chosen, and it's not something that we might say is aimed at anything higher other than one's day-to-day self-preservation. And, maybe you work a little more than that for comfort and entertainment. So we're already looking sort of in the direction of the last man here, we might say. But let's go back to the passage. Quote, "There have been ages when men believed with rigid confidence, even with piety, in their predestination for precisely this occupation, precisely this way of earning a living, and simply refused to acknowledge the element of accident, role, and caprice. With the help of this faith, classes, guilds, and hereditary trade privileges managed to erect those monsters of social pyramids that distinguish the Middle Ages, and to whose credit one can adduce at least one thing: durability. And duration is a first-rate value on earth. But there are opposite ages, really democratic, where people give up this faith, and a certain cocky faith, an opposite point of view, advance more and more into the foreground. The Athenian faith, that first becomes noticeable in the Periclean age, the faith of the Americans today, that is more and more becoming the European faith as well. The individual becomes convinced that he can do just about everything and can manage almost any role, and everybody experiments with himself, improvises, makes new experiments, enjoys his experiments, and all nature ceases and becomes art." End quote, and I'll interject again because this is why I love many of these passages in the Gay Science Book 5, because there are so many ways to take this and so many fun little nuances and complications, especially when we consider it in light of Nietzsche's broader corpus. So the Middle Ages, those monsters of social pyramids, the Middle Ages, of course, is a time in Europe in which your role, your occupation, the role you're playing in society, we might think of the role an actor plays, but also your function in society, what it is that you do, what your will is aimed at, that is all decided for you by, as Nietzsche says, class, by hereditary privilege, by the trade that your fathers worked in and your grandfathers, and by religion, all of these things. And many people yearn for this in the modern age, right? Against this sort of experimental way of life in which this hyper-individualism, as people often call it now, in which everyone is convinced he can do just about everything, can manage any role, can conduct his own experiments with himself, and is not bound really by anything. And I guess the standard argument for the people who might be nostalgic for the Middle Ages would be that we discovered in the course of liberating every individual from these bonds that the ties that bind do not just strangle us, but also hold communities together, that there was a great benefit to all of those apparently rigid roles and occupations that were forced on us, that there were benefits, that almost every advancement in technology, whether it be a scientific technology or in this case social, comes with benefits and costs. Or rather, one's perspective is going to determine whether an advancement is overall a benefit or overall a cost, depending on what it is that you value. There are no absolute costs and benefits, only costs and benefits, given a certain perspective, given a certain mode of valuation. It's interesting that Nietzsche says duration is a first-rate value on Earth. That would be almost a rather common sense point, but Nietzsche has never really been an ally of common sense. And even earlier in this book, and especially in his later writings and in Will to Power, Nietzsche has, we might say, come down on the side against duration or durability as a kind of social value. And that might seem strange, but what he's really going against there is duration as a kind of herd value, the self-preservative valuations made on the group level of wanting to keep everything the same, maintain the group the way that it is, maintain the values and the ideals of the group in their current form, and therefore hostility towards anything individual, experimental, evil, all of these things that might arise within the group or threaten it from without. Again, we might say that Nietzsche here is showing us things from another angle, as he has done in many of these passages in Book 5 of The Gay Science. And perhaps another way of squaring this circle would simply be duration for what purpose? Is it simply duration for the purposes of maintaining a certain social relationship the way that it is, or maintaining a certain social institution the way that it is, which might be a representation of herd values? Or is it something like a desire to create something monumental that stands the test of time and has a long posthumous legacy? In that case, durability might be a rather strong value. In the latter case, it might be a rather weak value. So it matters what kind of drive, what kind of instinct is aiming at durability or duration, as always, as it always does. And furthermore, we might notice that, as I was describing it in the first paragraph, okay, people just sort of accidentally fall into this role and then it becomes who they are. But that, as Nietzsche says here, it's not that they're then locked into this role in the manner of the Middle Ages. It's certainly not that. People do become identified with and associated with their job, but a counterbalancing principle to that, we might say, especially here in America, as Nietzsche mentions, is the idea that there's nothing holding you down like there was in the Middle Ages to a particular occupation. And so who you are is still very much identified with what you do, but we have this idea, perhaps fictional, perhaps to some extent true, probably some combination, that anyone can make of themselves anything that they want to or have the ability to do. That we have a meritocratic system, we have a fluid system. Perhaps today you're working at a McDonald's, but maybe in 5 years you'll be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company or a world-famous surgeon. Who knows? If you have the aptitude, maybe you can apply yourself and change your fundamental identity by taking on a new role. And why does Nietzsche associate this with Periclean Athens? Well, we can look to Pericles' funerary oration, in which he calls the Athenians the educators of the entire Hellenic world. And so, in the sense that they're not just masters of one thing, known for one occupation or role only. For example, the Spartans, known for war and basically nothing else, but are masters of all of these different arts, all of these different techniques. And so that is rather interesting too as a nuance, because here Nietzsche is associating the Americans with the Greeks in their golden age, the Periclean Athens, the Athens described in Thucydides. And yet, and you can find a passage in Will to Power where Nietzsche is rather disparaging of the Americans, no American future. It's oftentimes his tenor with America. And one might also think that the Middle Ages would be, even if Nietzsche is not the type who wants to romantically return to the Middle Ages, he would have a good laugh at these people who think that the return of feudalism might be a good idea, because it's just, whether it's desirable or not, it's not possible. But never mind that, this notion that, as he says in Human All Too Human, what street should you take? The street of your ancestors. What trade, therefore, should you try and seek after? Which occupation, which vocation, the role that your ancestors have played? It seems like he has a respect for this kind of development of talents over long generations in the same family. And yet the notion that we have here is a kind of laudatory description of everyone making new experiments of their lives, compared with America and Athens, as a kind of a way in which nature ceases. So naturalistic determinism, biological determinism, your role determined by nature, ceases and becomes art, which those are typically laudatory terms for Nietzsche. And yet there are even more complications as we continue with the passage. Quote, "After accepting this role faith, an artist's faith, if you will, the Greeks, as is well known, went step for step through a rather odd metamorphosis that does not merit imitation in all respects. They really became actors. As such, they enchanted and overcame all the world, and finally even, quote, the power that had overcome the world. For the Graeculus Histrio, which means, this is my interjection here, the little Greek actor. As Kaufman notes, Graeculus was a term used ironically by the Romans. So back to the text. The Graeculus Histrio vanquished Rome, and not, as innocents usually say, Greek culture. But what I fear, what is so palpable that today one could grasp it with one's hands, if one felt like grasping it, is that we modern men are even now pretty far along on the same road. And whenever a human being begins to discover how he is playing a role and how he can be an actor, he becomes an actor. End quote. And I think it bears a bit of explanation as to what Nietzsche is saying here. The actors vanquished Rome and not Greek culture. What does he mean, vanquished, right? Didn't Rome conquer Greece? Well, as Nietzsche says elsewhere, Rome is sort of a female culture, and that what it did was take things in, let them gestate within its womb, so to speak. Rome greedily absorbs and syncretizes from other cultures. The Greeks, on the other hand, are more of a male culture, more of a masculine culture. Now, are these, again, perhaps painfully a bit abstract and overgeneralized descriptions? Yes, whenever Nietzsche does this, he's very much self-aware of that, I think, and is just trying to draw out a point. And here, the point is that this metamorphosis that the Greeks went through as a result of this perhaps beautiful flourishing of experimentation in which every man can play every role, nature ceases and becomes art, is that they all become actors, because the role becomes something you can put on and take off. We've already spoken about this idea of becoming identified with your occupation because it's one of the areas in which your will is active, and therefore it comes to define you in some sense. And yet, there was a time, the Middle Ages, for example, in which what defined you was not fluid. It wasn't dynamic. It wasn't something that you picked up and then cast off again at your will, so to speak. It was something that endured beyond all of the changes of life. The social bonds, the things that linked you together with your community and with the pyramidal system of castes and grades of society. You were part of this vast web that could anchor yourself, locate yourself, triangulate who you were based on your relation to others. And so it wasn't just based on the fleeting individual decisions of what role you're going to take up at a given time, but this is what happens, at least according to Nietzsche's interpretation, over the course of Greek culture. And so it's a metamorphosis that doesn't merit imitation in all respects, which implies that it might merit emulation in some respects. And yet where do they end up? As a nation of actors, which is a term Nietzsche has used for the Greeks in other places in his work. And so even though it's often said that Rome took in the Greek culture and many of their gods are simply reskins of the Greek gods, they conquer the Greeks, they bring back many of the intellectual, educated Greeks as slaves to teach the Roman patricians. But of course, what happens? They end up reshaping the Roman patricians in their image, so to speak, and they begin to see, speaking Greek becomes the language of the educated in Roman society. That's at least the regular story. But Nietzsche says what really happens is that by the time the Romans conquer the Greeks, they're at this advanced stage of being a nation of actors, people for whom every occupation is simply a role, is simply a mask, and that's what conquers Rome. And it's interesting because Nietzsche has said in We Philologists that the differences between the Greeks and the Romans really need to be emphasized more, because especially at that time in studies of classical antiquity, the differences were acknowledged, but more often it was seen as sort of like Greco-Roman civilization, this sort of continuity where really, there might be differences, but maybe they're more similar to one another than they are different. I would say that was the overall attitude. And Nietzsche often emphasizes how, there's a great passage in We Philologists where he says, we need the Romans to see how things became what they are. To see how things could have become different than what they are, one ought to study the Greeks. That the Romans seem so familiar to us. There's that other line in Twilight of Idols where he says, who could have learned writing from a Greek? We had to have learned it from the Romans, and that's because we look at how our styles of writing and the way that we think in literary terms is very similar to the Romans, whereas Greek literature can seem like it's from another planet. And so in a way, this passage is an explanation of that. How is it that the Romans take in the Greek culture and yet they don't seem to really be changed by it? They seem to more resemble us. Nietzsche will say in a later passage we're going to consider today that Christianity is the last artifice of the Romans. And so we're linked to the Romans in terms of valuations, even if that was a product of perhaps a sickly, exhausted Rome. And so too with Rome, the way in which they really take in the Greeks is as this nation of actors. And that's what is taken into the Roman culture, not the full richness that might have existed earlier in Greek life. And so let's finish out the passage. Quote, "With this, a new human flora and fauna emerge that could never have grown in more solid and limited ages, or at least they would be left there, quote, below, under the ban and suspicion of lacking honor. It is thus that the maddest and most interesting ages of history always emerge when the, quote, actors, all kinds of actors, become the real masters. As this happens, another human type is disadvantaged more and more, and finally made impossible. Above all, the great architects. The strength to build becomes paralyzed. The courage to make plans that encompass the distant future is discouraged. Those with a genius for organization become scarce. Who would still dare to undertake projects that would require thousands of years for their completion? For what is dying out is the fundamental faith that would enable us to calculate, to promise, to anticipate the future in plans of such scope, and to sacrifice the future to them. Namely, the faith that man has value and meaning only insofar as he is a stone in a great edifice, and to that end he must be solid first of all, a stone, and above all not an actor. To say it briefly, for a long time people will still keep silent about it. What will not be built any more henceforth, and cannot be built any more, is a society, in the old sense of that word. To build that, everything is lacking, above all the material. All of us are no longer material for a society. This is a truth for which the time has come. It is a matter of indifference to me that at present the most myopic, perhaps most honest, but at any rate noisiest human type that we have today, our good socialists, believe, hope, dream, and above all shout and write almost the opposite. Even now one reads their slogan for the future, "Free society," on all tables and walls. Free society? Yes, yes, but surely you know, gentlemen, what is required for building that. Wood and iron, the well-known wooden iron, and it must not even be wooden, end quote. So that's a proverbial phrase or expression there at the end, which doesn't come through in English, but we might say, to do that, you just need a square circle. To do that, you just need a married bachelor, right? So you just need a wooden iron. It's a great choice, given that that expression is used in German because it can be used for something to indicate like a building material. What are we going to build this great edifice of? Well, we'll just need some of that well-known wooden iron. So what is the contradiction in terms that this is a metaphor for? Free society. And I'm reminded of, I believe the passage is in The Greek State, where Nietzsche says that the dependence of all civilization on slavery is the vulture that gnaws at the liver of the Promethean man of culture. That, as Nietzsche has expounded on in the earlier books of the gay science, all of the greatest accomplishments of human culture that are celebrated and lauded in present day, things like art and literature and plays and poems and great works of architecture and scientific advancements, these are all based on the division of labor in which some are made to labor and others are separated from the need to at least engage in subsistence labor. Much of this discourse in the gay science involves Nietzsche's discussions of otium, leisure. But in this specific context, we don't even really have to get too deeply into that topic. I mean, what was he talking about earlier? The Middle Ages, this web of relations that was set in stone, it was handed down to you, it makes you into a stone in this grand project of intergenerational building, and Nietzsche doesn't bring up this specific example in this passage, but it's rather obvious. The cathedral, the idea of this work of architecture that will take thousands and thousands of years, and it is a product of that specific provenance, that it's very difficult to imagine. I mean, there are other styles of grand architectural building, for example, the pyramids, but the specific meaning of the cathedral and why they were built very much comes out of the logic of the Middle Ages. Not only the values of honoring God, of wanting to create something with this intricacies in which no man who works on it will see the final product. It's something for the future generations, and Nietzsche speaks of not only is it for the future, but it sacrifices the future to it. So the future is used as a resource in which one knows that there will be many, many, many generations. It's not as if maybe my kids or grandkids will enjoy this, but maybe my great-great-great-great-great-grandkids will enjoy this. So I'm sacrificing their future too upon beginning this project, their future labor, to this great work of architecture, which is also a product of a society based on duration, a society with a sense of durability, in which we can trust that future generations will take up this project and complete it. And so, to return to the criticism of socialists at the end, what Nietzsche is saying here is that this idea of free society is trying to combine together these two rather mutually exclusive ways of the individual finding his role in society. There's the nation of actors and experimenters, in which things become ever more artistic. Remember the name of the passage, How Things Will Become Ever More Artistic in Europe. So this is the course we are going down. That mirrors the Athenians, in which everyone becomes an actor, and in which these projects of grand building will no longer really, they're not going to occupy our time. We're not going to do that kind of thing anymore. It's not on the table for us. And is that bad or good? Well, it's the reality. So we need to accept that. We are no longer the material for a society. We are not stones. That's a harsh truth if you wish for, if you yearn for those kinds of projects of grand building as a kind of justification or sanctification of culture. If you wish that that kind of thing could happen today, but Nietzsche is pouring cold water on that and saying no. But on the other side of that coin, the socialists who want a free society, well, no, society is established based on these inflexible roles. So what you get in this nation of actors is not a society in the old sense of the word. Now, we do have a use for the word society now to just mean the community, or just mean the country itself. American society, we could say, but Nietzsche would say that's a contradiction in terms as well. America is not a society in the old sense of the word. That is not possible for us anymore. What we have are a bunch of experimenting individuals who may have done something quite remarkable in causing nature to halt and making art of their lives. That might be, again, quite laudatory, but there is something that is lost there. That something that we can only have with one of those durable societies, which is not, maybe the central point we're getting at here, society is not free. In order to have a society, you must not be free in the sense that we conceive of it now, in the Periclean sense, in the sense of being able to simply pick up and put down roles as if it's a mask, or as if it's just simply a role in the sense of being an actor. And so I think we've gotten through most of the passage. I've spent far more time on it than I had planned to do, but that's, I think, going to be par for the course in Book 5. So let's move on to 357. On the old problem, what is German? Quote, recapitulate in your mind the real achievements of philosophical thinking that one owes to Germans. Is there any legitimate sense in which one might give the credit for these achievements to the whole race? May we say that they are at the same time the product of the, quote, German soul, or at least symptoms of that, in the sense in which, say, Plato's ideomania, his almost religious madness about forms, is usually taken also for an event and testimony of, quote, the Greek soul? Or should the opposite be the truth? Might they be just as individual, just as much exceptions from the spirit of the race as was, for example, Goethe's paganism with a good conscience? Or as is Bismarck's Machiavellianism with a good conscience, his so-called Realpolitik among Germans? Might our philosophers actually contradict the need of the German soul? In short, were the German philosophers really philosophical Germans? End quote. And really the only comment I have on this thus far. Plato's ideomania, his almost religious madness about forms, is usually also taken for an event and testimony of the Greek soul. As we all know, Nietzsche disagrees with that framing. Nietzsche says that's how Plato's ideas are taken, how they're usually taken, but that's not actually how he feels. He thinks Plato is, in some sense, the refutation of the pre-existing Greek ideals. And so we might say, even though he gives these counterexamples in Goethe and Bismarck, which I think are both quite clear examples as well, you know, Germany's this very Lutheran culture, very traditional when it comes to Protestant, particularly Protestant Christianity, but just Christianity in general. Paganism is this evil thing, and Goethe has this good-natured paganism. And, Nietzsche would even say elsewhere that Goethe wasn't really that pagan, but nevertheless, his version of the pagan ideal, there's something to be said for it. There's something to be said for the fact that he saw something in the Greek spirit and wished to bring it into modern life. There's that famous scene where Helen of Troy in Faust Part 2 is brought into the modern era in Germany, and she begins to speak within the Knittel verse that everyone else in Faust speaks, rather than in these unrhymed hexameters, which were proper to Greece. So there's a lot of depth for analysis in that one scene. Bismarck, Machiavellianism with a good conscience, right? So Machiavelli, this Southern figure, this Italian figure, really the founder of Realpolitik, although he wouldn't have used the German name, obviously. Bismarck is bringing the spirit of Machiavelli into Germany. It's not really something that's native to the Germans. So Nietzsche gives these other examples, but I would just say one way to look at it would be the way that Plato is usually taken as an expression of the Greek soul would be one possibility, but which Nietzsche thinks is wrong. The other possibility would be what Nietzsche sees as the reality of Plato, that he was the refutation of the pre-existing Greek values. That is the question. Are these German philosophers really philosophical Germans? Are they indicative of the German spirit? Or are they like Bismarck and Goethe? And as we all know, Nietzsche is rather down on the Germans in general, and so we should keep that in mind just to preface the rest of this passage, that if they are really philosophical Germans, that's not necessarily a good thing for Nietzsche, although, again, we shouldn't really think in these simple binaries. But what Nietzsche is about to say here is very interesting. It kind of runs up against some of the things he said elsewhere, which we are finding is a very common theme in Book 5 of The Gay Science, Nietzsche flipping the script on us, which he loves to do. So let's continue with the passage. Quote, I recall 3 cases. First, Leibniz's incomparable insight that has been vindicated not only against Descartes, but against everybody who had philosophized before him, that consciousness is merely an accident of experience, and not its necessary and essential attribute. That, in other words, what we call consciousness constitutes only one state of our spiritual and psychic world, perhaps a pathological state, and not by any means the whole of it. The profundity of this idea has not been exhausted to this day. Is there anything German in this idea? Is there any reason for surmising that no Latin could easily have thought of this reversal of appearances? For it is a reversal. Let us recall, secondly, Kant's tremendous question mark that he placed after the concept of, quote, causality, without, like Hume, doubting its legitimacy altogether. Rather, Kant began cautiously to delimit the realm within which this concept makes sense, and to this day we are not done with this fixing of limits. Let us take thirdly the astonishing stroke of Hegel, who struck right through all our logical habits and bad habits when he dared to teach that species concepts develop out of each other. With this proposition, the minds of Europe were preformed for the last great scientific movement, Darwinism, for without Hegel, there would have been no Darwin. Is there anything German in this Hegelian innovation, which first introduced the decisive concept of, quote, development into science? Yes, without any doubt. In all 3 cases, we feel that something in ourselves has been uncovered and guessed, and we are grateful for it and at the same time surprised. Each of these 3 propositions is a thoughtful piece of German self-knowledge, self-experience, self-understanding. Our inner world is much richer, more comprehensive, more concealed, we feel with Leibniz. As Germans, we doubt with Kant the ultimate validity of the knowledge attained by the natural sciences, and altogether everything that can be known causally. Whatever is knowable immediately seems to us less valuable on that account. We Germans are Hegelians, even if there had never been any Hegel, insofar as we, unlike all Latins, instinctively attribute a deeper meaning and greater value to becoming and development than to what, quote-unquote, is. We hardly believe in the justification of the concept of, quote, being, and also insofar as we are not inclined to concede that our human logic is logic as such, or the only kind of logic. We would rather persuade ourselves that it is merely a special case and perhaps one of the oldest and most stupid cases. It would be a 4th question, Whether Schopenhauer, too, with his pessimism, that is, the problem of the value of existence, had to be precisely a German. I believe not. The event after which this problem was to be expected for certain, an astronomer of the soul could have calculated the very day and hour for it. The decline of the faith in the Christian God, the triumph of scientific atheism, is a generally European event in which all races had their share, and for which all deserve credit and honor. Conversely, one might charge precisely the Germans, those Germans who were Schopenhauer's contemporaries, that they delayed this triumph of atheism most dangerously for the longest time. Hegel, in particular, was its delayer par excellence, with his grandiose attempt to persuade us of the divinity of existence, appealing as a last resort to our sixth sense, the historical sense. As a philosopher, Schopenhauer was the first admitted and inexorable atheist among us Germans. This was the background of his enmity against Hegel. The ungodliness of existence was for him something given, palpable, indisputable. He always lost his philosopher's composure and became indignant when he saw anyone hesitate or mince matters at this point. This is the locus of his whole integrity. Unconditional and honest atheism is simply the presupposition of the way he poses his problem, being a triumph achieved finally and with great difficulty by the European conscience, being the most fateful act of 2,000 years of discipline for truth that in the end forbids itself the lie in faith in God. You see what it was that really triumphed over the Christian God, Christian morality itself, the concept of truthfulness that was understood ever more rigorously, the Father Confessor's refinement of the Christian conscience, translated and sublimated into a scientific conscience, into intellectual cleanliness at any price, looking at nature as if it were proof of the goodness and governance of a God, interpreting history in honor of some divine reason as a continual testimony of a moral world order and ultimate moral purposes, interpreting one's own experiences as pious people have long enough interpreted theirs, as if everything were providential, a hint designed and ordained for the sake of the salvation of the soul. That is all over now. That has man's conscience against it. That is considered indecent and dishonest by every more refined conscience. Mendaciousness, feminism, weakness, and cowardice. In this severity, if anywhere, we are good Europeans, and heirs of Europe's longest and most courageous self-overcoming. As we thus reject the Christian interpretation and condemn its meaning like counterfeit, Schopenhauer's question immediately comes to us in a terrifying way. Has existence any meaning at all? It will require a few centuries before this question can even be heard completely and in its full depth. What Schopenhauer himself said in answer to this question was, forgive me, hasty, youthful, only a compromise, a way of remaining stuck in precisely those Christian ascetic moral perspectives in which one had renounced faith along with the faith in God. But he posed the question as a good European, as I have said, and not as a German." End quote. There's a bit more to the passage that we'll cover at the end, but I wanted to pause here and interpret this. So again, throughout this text, pay attention whenever Nietzsche says we. In this severity, if anywhere, we are good Europeans and heirs of Europe's longest and most courageous self-overcoming. So we fearless ones, we immoralists, we free spirits, so on and so forth. So Nietzsche, the people that he's speaking to here, we are inheritors of Schopenhauer's pessimistic questioning of the value of existence, which is something that comes from Christianity. And we've talked about this quite a bit. There's that passage about the moral skepticism that's developed in Christianity that we've discussed before. There's the passage how we too are still pious. Nietzsche develops this throughout the gay science, the idea of skepticism, the idea of a kind of ascetic demand for truthfulness as a product of Christianity that turns against Christianity itself, because it has to. So this Christian valuation of, and why is it ascetic? Renouncing everything that is not truth. The way the ascetic renounces sex, renounces worldly wealth and ambition, renounces any earthly pleasure. Renunciation is asceticism, right? So keeping oneself out of a sense of discipline from being tempted by what? by all of these things, interpreting a moral world order and ultimate moral purposes, interpreting one's own experience as pious people do, as if it's all every event that happens is a sign from God, is God pushing you, it's God's plan for your life. The thing that destroys Christianity is not just some rational calculation against it, but the fact that these very things have become indecent. And that's not something that we necessarily think, although people will come up with arguments for this. It's something that we feel inside. We sort of feel dirty or unclean, the way an ascetic might feel unclean if he violates one of the precepts of his monastic order, if he violates the hygienic discipline which he has sworn to live by. In the sense that we do not permit ourselves any of these metaphysical flights of fancy anymore. We view the world pessimistically, but as a final consequence of this faculty of skepticism, of wanting a cleanliness of all of our truths, not touched by anything that is indeterminate, that it has to be taken on faith, or that has the stench of being an anthropomorphism or a projection. We have developed a finely tuned eye for all of these things, and now we just simply cannot believe in such divine explanations and interpretations of our lives anymore. And that this is, again, it's on the level of conscience. It's very, very important, because I think many of us will feel this. It's why Nietzsche doesn't ever really provide an argument for atheism, by the way, and that's why he thinks it's a foregone conclusion that we're going in an atheist direction, because of this very fact that for whatever number of believers are still clinging on to the driftwood of the wreck of Christianity, most of us in the modern world, when we hear a religious interpretation of ordinary life, if somebody's sick and they say, yeah, demons are possessing me. If someone says, oh, my father, did your father's cancer go into remission? No, angels came down and healed his cancer. When we hear these things, it feels kind of icky, doesn't it? It's like, at least to most of us within this modern sort of mindset, it seems as though somebody is bringing in a superstitious, kind of messy, unclean, just these floating premises that really don't have any logical basis, don't have any scientific or empirical basis, and using them to interpret the world, and it just feels kind of dirty in the same way. Like our asceticism, our conscience says, yeah, that just feels like wishful thinking, or that doesn't feel like that's actually you seeking the truth. That feels like you're just believing a comfortable fiction or something that you heard or were taught. And so that very tendency was forged, sharpened, tempered within the Christian worldview itself, within the Christian valuations. And eventually that asceticism is taken so far that we can't even accept Christian superstitions any longer. And Schopenhauer, who is often criticized in Nietzsche's work by this time, by 1887, Schopenhauer is so often criticized, he is seen as, for one, not only the philosopher, the pessimist, from whom we are, in some sense, inheritors, we fearless ones, because he himself is an example of this skepticism by inquiring whether existence has any value at all. Nietzsche says, in that case, Schopenhauer is not a German event. He's a European event. He is not specifically German. This pessimism is created across all of Europe because it is necessarily Christian. It's created as a group project throughout Christendom. And in many ways, the German spirit, the philosophers who are decisively German, as Nietzsche says, Leibniz, Kant, and Hegel are all decisively German philosophers. So they're not philosophers who happen to be German. They truly are philosophical Germans. Rather surprising thing to say for Nietzsche in some sense. Especially because what he says of them could be seen as somewhat praiseworthy, at least in the Nietzschean sense. But he points out, and I think quite accurately, that the real foundational dispute between Hegel and Schopenhauer is this question of the value of existence. For Hegel, existence, becoming itself, is a revelation of the divine, of spirit in the world. And for Schopenhauer, it's just the opposite axiom is obvious. The world is not a holy place. There's no spirit here. Spirit, the divine, the holy life, that's all beyond, that's found in the negation of this world. That's found beyond this world. And so Hegel preserves this Christian attitude towards life, this divine interpretation of the world that might seem old hat when it's phrased in sort of plebeian commoner terms, again, like demons are possessing me or something like that. That all seems rather silly, but Hegel puts it in this very intense philosophical language that makes it almost seem respectable again, and thus preserves it for a very long time. Now, of course, Schopenhauer's not perfect, right? Because, as Nietzsche says, he remains stuck in the Christian ascetic moral perspectives, in which one had renounced faith along with the faith in God. And so this is the real task of the fearless one, just to do a bit of my own interpolation here, right? So if you renounce faith along with the faith in God, as a result of this process, that is a product of Christianity, if you nevertheless remain within the Christian ascetic moral ideas, which Schopenhauer does, Schopenhauer disbelieves in the specifics of the religion and the concrete truth of the religion, but thinks it points at an underlying philosophical or spiritual truth, that it models this sort of, it has a moral truth that it's modeling to us about the denial of the will, and that is the value of Christianity. Schopenhauer takes this pessimistic view of existence, and still, in some ways, his philosophy is a recapitulation to the ascetic ideal. And I think that's very important for Nietzsche, in seeing that the ascetic ideal persists even after Christianity is dead and gone, that it persists in a secular form, so to speak. I think what Nietzsche is looking for in these new philosophers of the future are people who, once they've thrown away, once they've used the scaffolding to build the house, they can throw away the scaffolding. Once the asceticism that does away with all faith has allowed you to escape from the Christian mindset and its valuations, maintaining that asceticism is no longer beneficial to you. You can throw that away with the Christianity once it has liberated you from Christianity, and then pursue a new valuation, principle for a new affirmative attitude towards life, at least potentially. I think that's what Nietzsche is looking for. But Schopenhauer still remains within that. But his pessimism and his open and honest atheism is incredibly important. It's not something specifically German, and clearly here Nietzsche has praise for it. He sees his philosophical project as inherited from it, as indeed he was influenced by Schopenhauer. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much time interpreting what he says about Leibniz and Kant and Hegel. I think it's actually relatively straightforward, and you can suss it out for yourself. Leibniz, the profundity of the idea that consciousness is not the entire spiritual and psychic world. This idea has not been exhausted to this very day. Well, Nietzsche clearly himself takes that idea and pushes it very far. The idea that consciousness is just a surface and sign world, he said that in this very text. So is that a distinctly German idea that Nietzsche has taken? Because the Germans, I guess what he's saying about the spirit of the Germans is this idea that we have a depth to us, that there's something far more complicated beneath the surface of consciousness, and that this is a reversal from the way the Latins think about the world, this reversal of appearances. And this is one of those areas in which it can be very hard to sort of understand exactly where Nietzsche stands on this, right? Because obviously Nietzsche is often on the side of living in appearance, affirming the appearance, and yet this is a glaring sort of apparent contradiction in his work, where he's often talking about what's beneath the surface of consciousness and talking about the depths, the soul being in the body rather than in the conscious mind, the rational ego consciousness, about the consciousness being a commentary on an unknown text. Is this not a reversal of the appearances? Because after all, because everything that's in our awareness is conscious, we might say. To be aware of something is to be conscious of it, almost by definition. Well, for beings who live in consciousness, essentially, all the time, it is quite a reversal to say that who you are is not specifically what's contained in consciousness, but that's only a small slice of it. So this seems to influence Nietzsche. Secondly, Kant's question that placed, the question mark he placed after the concept of causality, without, like Hume, doubting its legitimacy altogether, because for Kant this is part of the imposition of causality onto the world is something that we bring to bear to interpreting the world. It's part of, therefore, phenomenal experience of the world and not the noumenon, or at least we have no justification, no leg to stand on in saying that cause and effect is part of the world as it truly is, the world as such, not just the world as we experience it, because how could we possibly make that claim? And granted, I think Nietzsche might be saying Hume doubted its legitimacy altogether. Well, Hume affirms causality simply out of custom and tradition. At least that's my reading of Hume. I know there's differing opinions on this. Nevertheless, we can set all that aside. Kant delimits the realm within which this concept makes sense. And to this day, we are not done with the fixing of limits. So that's the sense in which it's German, right? The Germans loving to fix limits on things. I remember Hans-Georg Müller talking about how Germans are obsessed with purity. And what is purity all about? It's about setting a limit, keeping whatever doesn't belong out. So the Germans purify the religion in the form of Lutheranism. They purify the beer with the purity laws that they make. As a rather dark chapter in German history, they try to purify the race. But nevertheless, we can see the point that Nietzsche's making about the fixing of limits. And then, but yet again, Kant and the delimitation of cause and effect is something that we have to sort of cast out from the noumenal world, that we might say. And again, this is very much in keeping with Nietzsche. And then what he says about Hegel, that species concepts develop out of each other. Without Hegel, there would be no Darwin. Of course, Nietzsche's critical of Darwin, but not on this front, not on the idea of just evolution in and of itself, of development, of becoming. Nietzsche's certainly on board with that. And he, therefore, he affirms becoming. He's often talked of as a philosopher of becoming. And so Nietzsche affirms essentially all of these very German philosophical insights in his own work. And what does that say about Nietzsche? Well, the only comment I'll give at this point is simply that, as Nietzsche says, of the master and slave morality and beyond good and evil, in higher and complex societies, these two moralities, even though they're irreconcilable, can exist in the same measure, even within the same soul. And perhaps that Nietzsche contains these genuinely German philosophical insights that he carries through, but also this very un-German, European pessimistic insight from Schopenhauer, that both perhaps exist within his philosophy in equal measure, or rather just within him, within Nietzsche. He has very clearly, in all of these philosophers that he lists as distinctly German, and the Germans are these people that he points out how this has had, in his view, a negative effect for preserving the Christian way of thinking about the world, particularly with Hegel. And yet we can see all of these commonalities between what they say and Nietzsche's own philosophy, which is very interesting. And yet it's almost like in the sense where Nietzsche talks about Goethe, right? This man who had many different, multiple poles within himself, opposite antipodal tendencies, and he disciplines himself to wholeness. This idea of opposites drawing taut the bow of the soul. The idea that in the preface of Beyond Good and Evil, that we shouldn't be ungrateful to the dogmatism of the philosophers, even we free spirits, because that has created this enormous tension of the spirit by which we can shoot for the farthest goals. So I think that is a very important point here too. But Nietzsche makes it clear that, of course, we good Europeans are heirs of Europe's longest and most courageous self-overcoming. We are heirs of Schopenhauer's pessimism and his open and honest atheism and his interrogation of the value of existence. And so that is perhaps Nietzsche's creative act in the Goethean sense of organizing himself and determining, I am going to stand on the anti-German side to some extent, while not being ungrateful to the Germans, because that self-overcoming is always a process that is relational. What is there to be overcome if you don't have these opposite poles? And there's no growth, there's no development without agonistic relationships. And so I think that's all very interesting when it comes to this passage. And something comes to mind about the previous passage, actually, where Nietzsche's talking about all of these roles we can pick up and put down. That becomes sort of the defining trait of the modern age. That we become a culture of actors. It's interesting to consider this in light of that passage from Will to Power that Bataille cites at the beginning of On Nietzsche. This notion of the fragmentary human being and the intimations of a whole human being, which, and you can go and listen to that episode. It would be the first part of my episodes on Bataille after the interview with Stuart Kendall. So the first one on the book on Nietzsche. if you want to learn more about what Nietzsche means by that specifically. But there is this idea that, a nation purely of actors, even though that might be the reality of the situation that we're in, is by nature just as fragmentary of an existence as that, for example, Middle Ages existence. Because that's still fragmented, it's just fragmented in a durable way and in a way that places you in a web of relations. But every person is assigned their role, and whatever they could be elsewise, whatever they might have the capacity to do, that those potentials that are never realized, that is the sense in which they're fragmented. And the reason why I thought of this in regard to this passage is because, again, this is Nietzsche oftentimes modeling in a very implicit way what the whole human being is like, in that he is willing to acknowledge both his German and his rather un-German aspects or traits of his thought in this passage, and give them both their due in some sense, and still allow them to rage agonistically against one another. There's this enmity between Hegel and Schopenhauer, which is quite warranted because they are mutually exclusive in their positions. And Nietzsche certainly owes a debt to both Hegel and Schopenhauer. But let's move on and finish out the passage. Quote, "Or is it possible that at least the manner in which the Germans appropriated Schopenhauer's question proves that the Germans did have an inner affinity, preparation, and need for his problem? That after Schopenhauer one thought and printed things in Germany too, by the way, late enough, about the problems he had posed, is certainly not sufficient to decide in favor of such an inner affinity. One might rather adduce the peculiar ineptitude of this post-Schopenhauerian pessimism against this thesis. Obviously, the Germans did not believe in this affair as if they had been in their own element. This is not by any means an allusion to Edward von Hartmann. On the contrary, to this day I have not shaken off my old suspicion that he is too apt for us. I mean that he may have been a wicked rogue from the start, who perhaps made fun not only of German pessimism, but in the end he might even, quote, bequeath to the Germans in his will how far it was possible even in the age of foundations to make fools of them. But let me ask you, should we perhaps consider that old humming-top Bonson as a credit to the Germans, seeing how voluptuously he revolved his life long around his real dialectical misery and his personal tough luck? Perhaps precisely this is German. I herewith recommend his writings for this purpose, for which I have used them myself, as an anti-pessimistic diet, especially on account of their elegantiae psychologicae. And that means psychological elegance. Probably butchered my pronunciation there, but back to the text. Quote, "They should, I think, be effective even for the most constipated bowels and mind. Or could one count such dilettantes and old spinsters as that mawkish apostle of virginity, Mainlander, as a genuine German? In the last analysis, he was probably a Jew. All Jews become mawkish when they moralize. Neither Bonson nor Mainlander, not to speak of Eduard von Hartmann, gives us any clear evidence regarding the question whether Schopenhauer's pessimism, his horrified look into a de-deified world that had become stupid, blind, mad, and questionable, his honest horror, was not merely an exceptional case among Germans, but a German event. Everything else that one sees in the foreground, our bold politics and our cheerful fatherlandishness, which resolutely enough consider all matters with a view to a not very philosophical principle, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, which means subspecies, speciae, namely the German species, bears emphatic witness of the opposite. No, the Germans of today are no pessimists, and Schopenhauer was a pessimist, to say it once more, as a good European, and not a German." End quote. So I'll just read Kaufmann's footnote at the end, or just the beginning of it, where he says, quote, "When one considers this section as a whole, it differs from the other passages in which Nietzsche deals at length with the Germans. The achievements of Leibniz, Kant, and Hegel, which are credited to the Germans, are genuine." End quote. And then he has some idea that perhaps there was an event, there was some shift after, what does he say? After the above section, but before Twilight of Idols was written, maybe something changed Nietzsche's minds about the German, and maybe it was the accession to the throne of the last Kaiser. I find that kind of hard to believe. I really do tend to think that, and Kaufmann should know this, that Nietzsche, again, likes to flip the script on us. He likes to take an existing interpretation he's already given us about a certain figure or event or idea and turn it on its head, or just look at it from another vantage point and bring out something different about it. And I think that that's what he's doing here. And when it comes to what he says about Schopenhauer, I mean, yeah, he puts it maybe in slightly different terms than elsewhere, but I think it actually makes quite a great deal of sense about the way Nietzsche thinks about Schopenhauer, what Schopenhauer's place is in his relationship to Nietzsche's philosophy from Nietzsche's perspective, the way in which he conceptualizes Schopenhauer, the meaning of his philosophy as Nietzsche understands it at this point in his career after years and years of reflecting upon this. And the way he puts it at the end, his horrified look into a de-deified world. Remember what Nietzsche says back in Book 3 of The Gay Science about the shadows of God, these deifications of nature that still exist in our thought and persist beyond the death of God. And specifically in the context of this passage, compared with Hegel, there's nothing in the world that's divine or holy or a struggle towards freedom in Schopenhauer's view. Nothing develops in history at all. It's always the same story over and over again with slightly different stage players and different details. The will is blind, mad, stupid. So, the thing underlying all life and all existence fundamentally is just blind, raging desire. And everything else is a sort of falsification of that, a series of representations that artfully cover that over and seduce us to continue following the will in its blindness. So the world, the value of existence is nothing. It's not worth anything. And above all, it leads nowhere. And so, just to go through some of the figures again, very briefly, that Nietzsche mentions, I'd recommend looking into them yourselves, but Eduard von Hartmann, Nietzsche criticizes him extensively on the use and abuse of history for life, so I would recommend cross-referencing with that work. Hartmann tries to synthesize Hegel and Schopenhauer. So we can see there's this, as we mentioned earlier, tendency in Nietzsche to let the agonistic struggle between irreconcilable valuations rage in their tragic intensity. But, so Hegel and Schopenhauer are presented as not only opposites in terms of one being German, the other being un-German, but their valuation of existence. What is Hartmann doing? He's trying to square the circle. Nietzsche says, I'm not even alluding to him, right? So he doesn't even count as somebody who might be considered a pessimist. Who are the people who are considered pessimists? Well, Bonson, I'll just read Kaufmann's footnote because I'm not really familiar with Bonson. But he says that he had, quote, published books on characterology, philosophy of history, and the tragic as the law of the world. He opposed his own real dialectic to Hegel's dialectic, and was one of the very few German philosophers influenced by Schopenhauer, end quote. And then the other is, of course, Mainlander, who, as we know, Kaufmann's note is that he makes much of the will to death, of virginity, and of suicide. In fact, Mainlander killed himself. And, Kaufmann doesn't mention this, but Mainlander, his famous idea is essentially that God committed suicide, that there was a perfectly unified total being in the character of God. And then he realized, which is quite, we might say, a Schopenhauerian realization, that non-existence is preferable to existence, and then shatters himself, fragments himself into the phenomenal world, all of the differentiated different things that we see today. So it's like you can imagine Anaximander's apeiron, the indefinite. Imagine if the indefinite killed itself, and that's where we get all the definite things, right? It commits suicide. And so there's like this metaphysical importance to suicide in his work. As Kaufmann points out, this is the only time Nietzsche ever mentions Mainlander, which is interesting because many people have compared the suicide of God to Nietzsche's death of God. But I think it should be clear that similarity is kind of superficial, and I think, given Nietzsche's overall point here, what is he saying about Bonson and Mainlander, not to speak of Hartmann? They're not really pessimists. They're not the true inheritors of Schopenhauer's philosophy. They're sort of like German bunglers who took on, this guy who happened to be German, but had a very non-German, almost un-German insight. And, in a way, what does he say about Mainlander? That he's a moralizer at the end of the day, and he is, probably by implication pathological with his exaltation of virginity and so on and so forth. In other words, to put a bow on it, None of these people really produce a school of German pessimism that is really worthy of Schopenhauer. And interestingly enough, perhaps Nietzsche thinks that he serves such a role, even though he's not a pessimist in the style of Schopenhauer. He would say he's a pessimist of strength rather than Schopenhauer being a pessimist of weakness, but perhaps that would be the only way to appropriately inherit all of the energy that was created by Schopenhauer's daring to question the value of existence in the first place. And with that, wow, we've spent an hour on 2 sections, but they're pretty long sections and pretty deep sections. So with that, let's move on to 358. Quote, "The peasant rebellion of the spirit. We Europeans confront a world of tremendous ruins. A few things are still towering, much looks decayed and uncanny, while most things already lie on the ground. It is all very picturesque. Where has one ever seen more beautiful ruins? And overgrown by large and small weeds. The church is this city of destruction. We see the religious community of Christianity shaken to its lowest foundations. The faith in God has collapsed. The faith in the Christian aesthetic ideal is still fighting its final battle. An edifice like Christianity that had been built so carefully over such a long period, it was the last construction of the Romans, naturally could not be destroyed all at once. All kinds of earthquakes had to shake it. All kinds of spirits that bore, dig, gnaw, and moisten have had to help. But what is strangest is this. Those who exerted themselves the most to preserve and conserve Christianity have become precisely its most efficient destroyers, the Germans. It seems that the Germans do not understand the nature of a church. Are they not spiritual enough for that, or not mistrustful enough? The edifice of the church at any rate rests on a southern freedom and enlightenment of the spirit, as well as a southern suspicion of nature, man and spirit. It rests on an altogether different knowledge of man and experience of man than is to be found in the north. The Lutheran Reformation was, in its whole breadth, the indignation of simplicity against multiplicity, or to speak cautiously, a crude, ingenuous misunderstanding in which there is much that calls for forgiveness. One failed to understand the expression of a triumphant church, and saw nothing but corruption. One misunderstood the noble skepticism, that luxury of skepticism and tolerance, which every triumphant, self-assured power permits itself. Today, it is easy enough to see how in all cardinal questions of power, Luther's disposition was calamitously myopic, superficial, and incautious. He was a man of the common people, who lacked everything that one might inherit from a ruling caste. He had no instinct for power. Thus, his work, his will to restore that Roman work, became, without his knowing or willing it, nothing but the beginning of a work of destruction. He unraveled, he tore up with honest wrath what the old spider had woven so carefully for such a long time. He surrendered the holy books to everybody, until they finally got into the hands of the philologists, who are the destroyers of every faith that rests on books. He destroyed the concept of the church by throwing away the faith in the inspiration of the church councils, for the concept of the church retains its power only on condition that the inspiring spirit that founded the church still lives in it, builds in it, and continues to build its house. He gave back to the priest sexual intercourse with woman, but 3/4 of the reverence of which the common people, especially the women among the common people, are capable, rests on the faith that a person who is an exception at this point will be an exception in other respects as well. It is here that the popular faith in something superhuman in man, in the miracle, in the redeeming God in man, finds its subtlest and most insidious advocate. Luther, having given the priest woman, had to take away from him auricular confession. That was right, psychologically. With that development, the Christian priest was at bottom abolished, for his most profound utility had always been that he was a holy ear, a silent well, a grave for secrets. Everyone his own priest. Behind such formulas and their peasant cunning, there was hidden in Luther the abysmal hatred against the higher human being and the dominion of higher human beings as conceived by the Church. He smashed an ideal that he could not attain, while he seemed to abhor and to be fighting only against the degeneration of this ideal. Actually, he, the man who had found it impossible to be a monk, pushed away the dominion of the homines religiosi, and thus he himself made within the ecclesiastical social order what in relation to the civic social order he attacked so intolerantly, namely a peasant rebellion. What afterward grew out of his Reformation, good as well as bad, might be calculated approximately today. But who would be naive enough to praise or blame Luther on account of these consequences? He is innocent of everything. He did not know what he was doing. The European spirit became shallow, particularly in the north, more good-natured if you prefer a moral term, and there is no doubt that this development advanced a large step with the Lutheran Reformation. The mobility and restlessness of the spirit, its thirst for independence, its faith in a right to liberty, its, quote, naturalness, all this also grew owing to the Reformation. If in connection with this last point one wanted to concede it the value of having prepared and favored what we today revere as, quote, modern science, one would surely have to add that it also shares the responsibility for the degeneration of the modern scholar, for his lack of reverence, shame, and depth, for the whole naive guilelessness and ostentation ingenuousness in matters of knowledge, in short, for that plebeianism of the spirit, which is a peculiarity of the last 2 centuries, and from which even pessimism has not yet liberated us. Modern ideas also belong to this peasant rebellion of the North against the colder, more ambiguous, and mistrustful spirit of the South that built its greatest monument in the Christian Church. Let us not forget in the end what a church is, as opposed to any state. A church is above all a structure for ruling that secures the highest rank for the more spiritual human beings, and that believes in the power of spirituality to the extent of forbidding itself the use of all the cruder instruments of force. And on this score alone, the church is, under all circumstances, a nobler institution than the state. End quote. Now, first of all, as Kaufmann points out, there are significant differences with the way that Nietzsche treats Luther in this passage as he does elsewhere. And as he says, it's not, what does he say? Quote, that Nietzsche felt a certain ambivalence about Luther is hardly remarkable. Anyone who knows enough about Luther is likely to admire some aspects of his character and his accomplishments while being appalled by others, end quote. Which, gets at it a little bit, but I think what Kaufmann might be leaving out here is that it's not really a matter of whether Nietzsche praises Luther in some places or is appalled by him in other places, although I wouldn't really say Nietzsche's ever appalled by Luther. I would say it's just more a matter of the terms of praise or the terms of his lack of praise. I mean, notice at the end, he says the colder and more mistrustful spirit of the South. So the colder spirit of the Southern Europeans, of the Catholic Europeans, the Mediterranean Europeans, that in and of itself is a kind of strange inversion of the way that Nietzsche talks about this. And again, we have this idea that Luther is sort of against interiority and depth and true spirituality, whereas at other times in his work, Nietzsche is speaking about Luther as someone who brings this about. Like he really takes that Christian mistrust and skepticism through, again, trying to purify the church of all ambiguity. And some of that does come through in this passage. Where he talks about, the Lutheran Reformation, the indignation of simplicity against multiplicity. So, of course, we might think of Nietzsche's comments about the stultifying sort of stagnation that comes about under the monotheistic ideal, and Lutheranism as a further advancement along this course, a fuller expression of it, again, of wanting to purify everything, establish these limits, and the moral looseness of the church in the South. The fact that the Catholic Church had more of maybe a boys will be boys attitude, sinful humans will be sinful humans attitude, we might say. Just the difference in Nietzsche's interpretation here seems to be that it's not really in the name of a deeper interiority or more profound soul-searching or something like that. Again, to make reference to Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history, the way he sees Protestantism, which sometimes aligns with Nietzsche's criticism of it. Here he's saying, no, it's really just a sort of simple-minded peasant desire for, again, simplicity. And here perhaps another variance with what Nietzsche has said before in Human All Too Human is that Luther prevented a pagan revaluation, a resurgence of pagan values in Europe, that he essentially threw Europe back into medieval ways of life. Here Nietzsche's looking at it from another angle, where he's saying, well, no, ultimately it is Lutheran Protestantism that will ultimately destroy Christianity. That actually those who, as he says, exerted themselves the most to preserve Christianity have become its most efficient destroyers. So I just wanted to acknowledge those differences before, we get more deeply into interpreting the passage, which, nevertheless is quite congenial with the spirit of the Gay Science Book 5, as we have seen. We're getting a lot of different perspectives here and variations on the typical themes of Nietzschean philosophy. But I think the most important aspect of this passage is in seeing Lutheranism as a peasant rebellion of the spirit. What does Nietzsche mean by this? Well, we can analogize to some of the things Nietzsche has said earlier in the Gay Science about the dissolution of the distinction, of a hard distinction between noble and common. That comes about as a result of, in Nietzsche's time, we might say, industrial capitalism, about, he sees it as part of democracy. But again, part of this idea that your boss at the factory is no better than you on some fundamental level. He doesn't have a divine sanction from the gods to run the factory. He found himself there by, again, accidental circumstances, or because he, perhaps inherited some money, or perhaps he played the stock market well. There's always an element of chance, of risk, of gambling in economic life. The market, yes, there's obviously skill and merit involved, but there's so much that's left up to chance. And it becomes possible in financial markets in order to you can gain large sums of money very quickly or lose large sums of money very quickly. And so this notion that there is some essential distinction between the one who's commanding, who's giving the orders, and one who has to follow them begins to break down because the common person says there's nothing really essentially different between me and him. A few turns on the wheel of fortune and I could easily be the factory boss and he could be the worker. Well, what we see in this passage is something similar happening in the spiritual life, where the priest was set above the common people. He became a new aristocracy. That's Nietzsche's narrative in the Genealogy of Morals. Again, comes out the same year as Book 5 of the Gay Science. And so, this notion that the priest, by denying himself all of these things, by modeling the ascetic ideal, begins to seem as something almost superhuman, begins to seem as though, all of these ordinary desires and impulses to which we are all subject, somehow he seems beyond them. Somehow he's able to deny himself. Self-denial becomes a kind of power in the hands of the priest. And so by the priest not having sexual intercourse with women, the priest can't get married. He can't have children. He has to remain celibate. That's part of the Catholic doctrine. The priest, therefore, appears as something superhuman. He is not subject to the sexual impulses to which all of us are subject. And this isn't to say that he doesn't have temptation, but the fact that he is able to overcome that temptation, the fact that he is able to wield this self-denial as a power, is precisely the thing that sets him above us. The priest is different from the rest of you in the Catholic worldview. Again, we're all sinners, we're all equal in the eyes of God, but nevertheless, these, we might say, rather primordial prejudices about the holy man are carried through in the Catholic Church to its benefit. Because as Nietzsche says, what is he? 3/4 of the reverence that the common people have, especially the women of the common people have, for the priests is because of this denial of their sexual impulses. The fact that they seem to be above that. Why particularly the women? Well, from a Nietzschean standpoint, the way you would see it is like the woman's chief power is that men want her. The priest doesn't want her. And so what else happens? Well, also the confession, the right of we spoke about this the last time earlier in Book 5 where Nietzsche is discussing this, how the priest becomes a grave for secrets, a holy ear, a silent well, right? So part and parcel with this idea that the priest is sort of like the representative for God the Father on earth and set above all of us as this different kind of aristocracy. It's not a knightly aristocracy, but a holy aristocracy. Part and parcel with that is the idea that you confess your sins to the priest, that he's the one who allows you to discharge all of your inner ugliness, all of your inner muck, all of your inner guilt and sinfulness, allows you to forget all of those things. He can play that role because of the fact that he is seen, again, as superhuman because of this power of self-denial. So with the priests being able to marry, this power of confession goes away as well. And thus we have this idea, every man his own priest. There are no special human beings. And by the way, I mean, if you don't think that this idea persists in Protestantism today, it absolutely does. I remember back in the day when I was much more involved with the debates between atheists and Christians on YouTube and all of that. I remember seeing a video by a Protestant who was saying, guys, you just have to remember that your priest or your preacher, he's just a human being, and there's nothing special about him. He has no special authority. Your salvation is between you and God, and you have to get right with God. And the preacher might be there to help guide you and lead a spiritual community, but he doesn't have any special. There's nothing special about him. That's actually a rather common attitude among Protestants. And Nietzsche says again, that's to the religion's detriment. The same thing is happening there that happens in democratic capitalist society with the breakdown of the order of rank. That's happening in a spiritual sense. What else does Luther do away with? Well, the idea of the inspiration of the church councils. The fact that the church, indeed in Catholicism, the Pope, who's an infallible interpreter of Scripture, or just the fact that there were any institutions, that the Holy Spirit is alive in the church, guiding the church. That's, the Orthodox, especially, even though they don't have a pope, so they don't have a concept of papal infallibility, but they certainly uphold the infallibility of the ecumenical councils, or if not infallibility, that's the highest authority on earth. Because if you get together all the bishops of all the different churches and they all agree, if you don't think the Spirit is moving there and guiding them, then you essentially think there's no point to the church. There is no earthly power to the church. There is no Holy Spirit in man guiding him. And therefore the church is rather impotent. So it's kind of a load-bearing doctrine for Christianity, that because there's this eternal problem of interpretation, right? There's this eternal problem that, the text says what it says, but people can interpret, especially a text like the Bible, so many different ways. And so how do you know which interpretation is right? And so you have to have some sort of foundation to rest on, some sort of security in saying that your interpretation is correct. And the way that Christianity has traditionally done this is with the idea that the Spirit moves through the church and guides the interpretations. If you dispense with all of that, you've dispensed with any power to the church. And so even though all of these, people might say in response to this, there are Episcopalians, there's Presbyterians, there's all sorts of Protestants who have priests or who have preachers. There are still church hierarchies outside of Catholicism, following from the Reformation. Yeah, that might all be true, but ultimately, again, there is no, from a thoroughly Protestant mindset, you can't say that there's anything special about that church. There's anything any more special than any person's interpretation of the Bible. Because again, every man his own priest. And if the priest can get married and have children and all of these things, and, and there's no Holy Spirit guiding the interpretations, and we've lost all of the faith in all of these things. What's effectively happened is that even though Luther himself railed against the peasant rebellions, even though Luther didn't support, for example, the Anabaptists and thought that that was an idea from Satan, that we should share all things in common and that the peasants should uprise and disrupt the social hierarchy, nevertheless, in trying to preserve Christianity, he destroys it by destroying any possibility of hierarchy or order of rank within the spiritual life. Because at the end of the day, it's just between you and God. You're your own priest. And just to say a word about the final point that Nietzsche makes, that the church is above all a structure for ruling that secures the highest rank for more spiritual human beings and believes in the power of spirituality to the extent of forbidding itself the use of cruder instruments of force. This is a nobler institution than the state. For one, this might pose a problem for those who like to interpret Nietzsche's will to power as sort of a license to use naked force and see all indirect uses of force as some sort of weakness or something like this, which Nietzsche, as we can see here, clearly doesn't believe. If you're able to compel action without the naked use of force, almost speaks even more to your power, doesn't it? But we might say, my own comment on this would be, states come and go. The state is a hollow idol for Nietzsche. He is not a state worshiper. He never has been. But the church, we might say that it is in and of itself the outward form, the flesh and bones of the ideal, the spiritual idea, like the spiritual form of the order of rank, right? The rank ordering that is given to us by a legislator of value. That's what actually rules human beings. Values are where the action is. That's what governs human action. And that the worldly instantiated form of that is the church. It's not in the state. To the extent that states perhaps might have served that role in the past, they were perhaps tutelary states, or they were states that had a divine sanction, that were in some sense unified with the church, or had a religious justification for their existence. To the extent that they're just states, the church is far more powerful. It's far nobler, and that's precisely the thing that Luther destroyed. And as Nietzsche says, Luther is innocent in doing this. He didn't intend to do that, but we have to look to who Luther was. He himself is not a noble soul. He's a common person through and through. And so unconsciously, insensibly, he sets us down this course in which Christianity is destined to be eventually destroyed. And again, very different from the ways that Nietzsche talks about Luther or the Reformation, or even the difference between the Northern and Southern European spirit. But I think the thrust of the passage, the broader thrust of the passage about this dissolution of any sense of nobility that happens as a result of the Reformation, and this leading in some sense to Christianity's destruction, I think is very easy to understand in context of Nietzsche's broader idea, corpus of ideas. And so with that, let's move on to 359. Quote, "The revenge against the spirit and other ulterior motives of morality. Morality, where do you suppose that it finds its most dangerous and insidious advocates? There is a human being who has turned out badly, who does not have enough spirit to be able to enjoy it, but just enough education to realize this. He is bored, disgusted, and despises himself. Having inherited some money, he is deprived even of the last comfort, quote, the blessings of work. Self-forgetfulness in daily labor. Such a person, who is fundamentally ashamed of his existence, perhaps he also harbors a few little vices, and on the other hand cannot keep himself from becoming more and more spoiled and irritable by reading books to which he is not entitled, or by associating with more spiritual company than he can digest, such a human being who has become poisoned through and through, for spirit becomes poison, education becomes poison, possessions become poison, solitude becomes poison for those who have turned out badly in this way, eventually ends up in a state of habitual revenge, will to revenge. What do you suppose he finds necessary, absolutely necessary, to give himself in his own eyes the appearance of superiority over more spiritual people, and to attain the pleasure of an accomplished revenge, at least in his imagination? Always morality. You can bet on that. Always big moral words, always the rub-a-dub of justice, wisdom, holiness, virtue, always the stoicism of gesture. How well stoicism conceals what one lacks. Always the cloak of prudent silence, of affability, of mildness, and whatever may be the names of all the other idealistic cloaks in which incurable self-despisers, as well as the incurably vain, strut about. Do not misunderstand me. Among such born enemies of the spirit, there comes into being occasionally the rare piece of humanity that the common people revere, using such names as saint and sage. It is from among men of this sort that those monsters of morality come who make noise, who make history. St. Augustine is one of them. Fear of the spirit, revenge against the spirit, how often these propelling vices have become the roots of virtues, even nothing less than virtues. And a confidential question, even the claim that they possessed wisdom, which has been made here and there on earth by philosophers, the maddest and most immodest of all claims, has it not always been to date, in India as well as in Greece, a screen above all, at times perhaps a screen chosen with pedagogical intent, which hollows so many lies? One has a tender regard for those still in the process of becoming, of growing, for disciples who must often be defended against themselves by means of faith in a person, by means of an error. Much more often, however, it is a screen behind which the philosopher saves himself, because he has become weary, old, cold, hard, as a premonition that the end is near. Like the prudence animals have before they die, they go off by themselves, become still, choose solitude, hide in caves, and become wise. What? Wisdom as a screen behind which the philosopher hides from spirit, end quote. So much of this passage, I think, is somewhat straightforward, especially if you've read the genealogy, because Nietzsche is in some sense just riffing on what he's already said in the genealogy here of morality being a screen for the will to revenge. So somebody who's badly turned out. You notice he doesn't say somebody who's necessarily oppressed or a slave or downtrodden or something like this. He's even talking about somebody who might be in a good financial position, who's inherited some money, but who is also worse off for that because he doesn't even have the blessings of work. He can't lose himself in daily labor of self-forgetfulness. He's just alone with himself, and he knows that he is inferior, and he has just enough education to recognize this. And, I think this type of person, very easy to understand in modern times. We have this idea of like the midwits, for example, right? A person who is just smart enough to have, perhaps unconsciously, an inferiority complex. Someone perhaps who always has something to prove. And, Nietzsche says, what does he say here? For spirit becomes poison, education becomes poison, possessions become poison, solitude becomes poison. These things are not poison in and of themselves to Nietzsche. Obviously not. And they don't necessarily speak to someone's bad social position. They speak to a sort of internal inadequacy. And so he says, what is the type he's describing? The most dangerous, insidious advocate of morality. So the worst people to advocate, who become moral zealots, are those who are not, people often describe ressentiment as if it's the weak and the impoverished and people who have, like, again, a bad social position taking revenge against society. But in this case, at least, Nietzsche's saying the worst advocates of morality, the people who mask their revenge in moral terms, are actually just bad people in and of themselves, or if not bad in and of themselves, people who have not turned out well. Maybe someone who would have been happy as just a laborer, again, in the Middle Ages, had he never read any books about, say, socialism and free society and something like this. Or someone who, if they were a bit more spirited. Let's also keep in mind, spirit also means mind in terms of Geist, the way Nietzsche is using it. And we should really entertain both meanings. So somebody being spirited is somebody who is, really Nietzsche is talking about a level of intelligence here. He's talking about someone, this is why he's talking about education and reading books. So someone who's just intelligent enough to realize how unintelligent he really is, how unremarkable he really is. And that perhaps such a person might have been more satisfied in a world where everyone's not expected to go out and make something of themselves, where everyone's not sold this fiction about, a pure meritocracy in which you can become whatever role you want to take on. We can imagine that there are types of people who are botched and, again, badly turned out, it would be the term in German, specifically by this type of society that we live in now, in which education is made freely available to everyone, but not everyone really, as Nietzsche says, there's certain books you don't have a right to read. And is this elitist? Well, yeah, of course it is, but it's very hard to say that that's not true. And maybe just to speak from personal experience, when I was in high school, the line from every authority figure, every teacher, every counselor, every administrator, was that we want to get every kid into college. And there were a lot of kids who I don't think would have been happy in college. There were, quite a few who should have perhaps been trained or prepared for a course of life that wasn't going to involve a college education. And I think people are more open to that now, but at the time, this just wasn't even considered. It was basically presented as though, do you want to have a good paying job or do you want to be a janitor? But then it's like, what is college actually? It's like there's quite a bit there that's designed to weed you out. They do courses to weed you out in the first year you're in college, and you're going to be exposed to all sorts of irrelevant information for the job market. I mean, even this, a lot of college is just to see if you will sit down, shut up, obey the rules, swallow shit for 4 years, basically. That tells us that you can be relied on to be a good little instrument in the office or wherever, your destination ends up being after you're put through this sorting mechanism. But, nevertheless, I can imagine that it's like there are many people that would just be a lot happier if they could just go into a trade and not have to read about, the Spanish Civil War and learn calculus and all of these things. And nevertheless, I'm kind of digressing here a little bit, but I think, you know, this notion, this meme in modern society that the midwits are sort of the most moralizing and the most resentful people a lot of the time, I think it exemplifies what Nietzsche is saying here. That it's not, the problem isn't the vindictiveness of the lower classes necessarily, although that certainly could be a problem from Nietzsche's perspective. The problem is the vindictiveness of the people who, like Winston in 1984, are members of the outer party. And they've been determined, like, he's gone through all the society's sorting mechanism. They've placed him in this job where he's fulfilling his function. But he feels like he could be destined for something better. Like he has an aptitude to be in the inner party, the inner circle that really makes the decisions and runs things and has all of these privileges. And the functionaries of the outer party, I believe this is in Goldstein's book, which is actually a tool of subtle propaganda on the part of the party, that it's really the war in society is between the high and the middle grades of the classes, right? That's really where the war goes on, because the high always has to suppress the ambitions of the middle, who want to, of course, are envious, are jealous of the people who are in the highest class. And indeed, the inner party hates and wants to stamp down that their enemy is the outer party. The proles are easily pacified, right? The problem is you have all these people in the inner party who are these, like, people basically described here, who are going to be resentful and have a will to revenge against those who, made them stop short of attaining greatness, of attaining the highest position that they could possibly have. But in any case, in context of what Nietzsche is saying here, these are the biggest moralists, and they're the ones who will be always invoking these big moral words. And that morality, therefore, is a screen for these enemies of the spirit. So the enemies of those who have intelligence, yes, but we might also say, the way Nietzsche puts it in this passage, depth. We might even talk about it in terms of willpower, in terms of will. And the interesting thing is at the end, the confidential question, the claim that they possessed wisdom that was held by philosophers, the maddest and most immodest of all claims. Well, didn't Nietzsche say earlier in The Gay Science that the philosophers always claimed that they didn't have wisdom, and that this itself was a screen for the fact that they felt that they did have wisdom? So even in this book, Nietzsche's contradicting himself. But again, that's why I think he says it's a confidential question. What does that mean? I'm asking you this in confidence. This is a question for my esoteric followers, for the fearless ones. We can ask such questions like this. So maybe, and this is me interpolating again, rather than interpreting, as in inserting something, inserting my own assertions here, that perhaps among we fearless ones, we can entertain all sorts of questions that might seem to have contradictory premises, that might seem to be based on different ideas about the origins of things or the real meaning of a phenomenon. We can entertain all sorts of contradictory ideas, contradictory perspectives and vantage points, and just treat them, out of our love of all that is questionable, and follow those lines of inquiry. And so here he presents things rather differently, where the philosopher does project that he has wisdom, and he includes, he says, India as well as Greece. So these are places that not only had many philosophers, but also spiritual figures, sages, as he says, and saints. They put up a screen of wisdom with pedagogical intent. So that means, as he says here, basically like fishing for those people who must be defended against themselves by means of faith in a person, which means by means of an error, because ultimately the wisdom is just a screen. So oftentimes these people who have this intense burning will to revenge can be defended against themselves by adopting some philosophy or religion or moral code that perhaps diffuses this. But again, I think a lot of this is easy to understand because Nietzsche's speaking in these terms of taking an imaginary revenge and morality just being a sheen for that, a screen for it, as he says here. St. Augustine being one of these people, that's a rather unsurprising thing for Nietzsche to say. And more often than not, however, the screen that the philosopher puts up of wisdom is actually covering over his own exhaustion, the fact that he's become weary, old, cold, and hard, a premonition that the end is near, like the prudence animals have before they die. And so wisdom is a screen behind which the philosopher hides from spirit. Spirit, again, meaning intellect, Geist, depth, in this specific context. Again, somewhat different from the way Nietzsche has described the philosopher, even in past sections in this very book, but I think the common thing here is that wisdom is something that is, as we see in this passage, acted. The true depth, spirit, well, that won't gather you any disciples, will it? Because the people who the common people revere are those saints and sages who come from among the class of those monsters of morality, those people who are perhaps had potential but became botched, or perhaps had, they have half of the amount of spirit that you might need to become a philosopher, someone truly extraordinary, but not enough, and that makes them forever vindictive against really the world, or against their fate, or against their place in the world. And it gets directed outward and projected at perhaps the system or the state or whatever it might be, and that's who ultimately collects disciples. So the philosopher has to put up this false front of wisdom if he does want to collect his own disciples. Again, that false front that I am in some ways superhuman. I am somehow different from all of the rest of you. But, okay, let's move on. Let's go to 360. Quote, "Two kinds of causes that are often confounded. This seems to me to be one of my most essential steps and advances. I have learned to distinguish the cause of acting from the cause of acting in a particular way, in a particular direction, with a particular goal. The first kind of cause is a quantum of dammed-up energy that is waiting to be used up somehow, for something, while the second kind is, compared to this energy, something quite insignificant, for the most part a little accident, in accordance with which this quantum discharges itself in one particular way. A match versus a ton of powder. Among these little accidents and matches I include so-called purposes, as well as the even much more so-called vocations. They are relatively random, arbitrary, almost indifferent in relation to the tremendous quantum of energy that presses, as I have said, to be used up somehow. The usual view is different. People are accustomed to consider the goal, purposes, vocations, etc., as the driving force, in keeping with a very ancient error, but it is merely the directing force. One has mistaken the helmsman for the steam, and not even always the helmsman, the directing force. Is the goal, the purpose, not often enough a beautifying pretext, a self-deception of vanity after the event that does not want to acknowledge that the ship is following the current into which it has entered accidentally, that it, quote, wills to go that way because it must, that it has a direction to be sure, but no helmsman at all? We still need a critique of the concept of purpose, end quote. And I love the way Nietzsche puts this here, a match versus a ton of powder. So the match is the intention, the purpose, the goal. So, you have a huge crate of dynamite that's all this potential energy, and all it needs is the strike of a match for the whole thing to go up, to explode. The striking of the match is merely a proximal cause, and it's something that Nietzsche says might even be accidental. And he does use the idea of like a ship, it's another metaphor later in the passage, of a ship following a current, and you have the helmsman, as if he's steering the ship. And yet it's the fact that the ship was already going in this way, following this current, that we therefore say it has the intention, the helmsman intended to go that way. In fact, there's no helmsman at all. So he even sort of removes, it's even actually a more extreme view of the role of intention or purpose or goal than it might even seem at first glance. Because it's rather analogous to Spinoza's thrown stone, isn't it? Where Spinoza talks about if a stone thrown through the air had consciousness, if it had sentience the way we do, and it was consciously narrating to itself and explaining its actions, it would have an explanation for why I want to fly in this specific course and arc through the air in this way and land right over there at that particular spot, even though, as we all know, the stone that's thrown, once it's already cast into the air, catapulted into the air, there's no, like, even if the stone was conscious, its will, its intentions couldn't change anything at that point. It's just following the course it's already on. So the helmsman is sort of irrelevant if the ship is simply following a current that it was already following. It's sort of like, so even the match being struck, right? The point that we should really emphasize is that it's a little accident in accordance with which this quantum discharges itself in one particular way. So the helmsman isn't even important. The match isn't even really important. It's a surface phenomenon. You have all this energy built up, and it just has to be used in a certain way. And oftentimes we see this with like a political event. Was World War I caused by the assassination of the Archduke, or was all of Europe a powder keg, and that was just the match? And, we've talked about this in so many different ways in the podcast. The intention is the surface and the skin of an action. And like the skin, it reveals something, but it conceals far, far, far more. And that the intention, what Nietzsche says in Beyond Good and Evil, that in an extra-moral age, if we overcome morality, we'll understand that the real meaning of an action actually has to do with what is unintentional in it. So all of that energy that's been dammed up, that has to be used for something, that has to discharge itself in some way, and then is accidentally triggered by some sort of surface phenomenon. And notice Nietzsche says here, I include so-called purposes as well as even much more so-called vocations. So this relates us back to before, where the way in which we find ourselves into a so-called calling from God, that's the way we used to interpret things, as a sort of divine plan for our lives. And then now we have this notion in modern liberal society that it's our free will and it's our free decision. We make something of ourselves and so on. No, Nietzsche says that's all just an accident. These things are random, arbitrary, almost indifferent in relation to the tremendous quantum of energy that presses, as I have said, to be used up somehow. And so to go back to the title of the passage, there's the conflation, two kinds of causes that are often confounded. So there's the real cause, which Nietzsche presents as something that's been building up for a long time. It's a sort of gradual idea of gradual buildup of energy, and then just simply the proximal cause, which is just accidental. It could be anything. Often Nietzsche uses this language of drives seizing upon an explanation or a reason or something moral, right? So we might say in the previous passage, the man with this intense will to revenge, that's the energy that's being built up within him. This desire for revenge is mounting to these huge proportions. And then perhaps he latches onto a moral cause. That drive, that immense drive for revenge, that immense energy for revenge, might latch on to some particular instance of something that could be interpreted as an injustice. That simply gives that botched individual the pretext to do what he already wanted to do anyway, and rail against all of society and its injustices and so on and so forth. And so we still need a critique of the concept of purpose, the idea that there's intentionality and purposiveness to our actions. We need to critique that and see that really there's a physiological reality going on that has very little to do with all of those things. And indeed, it's a perennial theme in Nietzsche's work. Let's move on to 361. Quote, on the problem of the actor. The problem of the actor has troubled me for the longest time. I felt unsure, and sometimes still do, whether it is not only from this angle that one can get at the dangerous concept of the artist, a concept that has so far been treated with unpardonable generosity. Falseness with a good conscience, the delight in simulation exploding as a power that pushes aside one's so-called, quote, character, flooding it and at times extinguishing it, the inner craving for a role and a mask, for appearance, in excess of the capacity for all kinds of adaptations that can no longer be satisfied in the service of the most immediate and narrowest utility. All of this is perhaps not only peculiar to the actor. Such an instinct will have developed most easily in families of the lower classes, who had to survive under changing pressures and coercions, in deep dependency, who had to cut their coat according to the cloth, always adapting themselves again to new circumstances, who always had to change their mien and posture until they learned to gradually turn their coat with every wind and thus virtually to become a coat, and masters of the incorporated and inveterate art of eternally playing hide-and-seek, which in the case of animals is called mimicry, until eventually this capacity, accumulated from generation to generation, becomes domineering, unreasonable, and intractable, an instinct that learns to lord it over other instincts, and generates the actor, the, quote, artist, the zany, the teller of lies, the buffoon, fool, clown at first, as well as the classical servant, Gil Blas. For it is in such types that we find the prehistory of the artist, and often enough even of the, quote, genius. In superior social conditions, too, a similar human type develops under similar pressures. Only in such cases, the histrionic instinct is usually barely kept under control by another instinct. For example, in the case of diplomats. Incidentally, I am inclined to believe that a good diplomat would always be free to become a good stage actor if he wished, if only he were, quote, free. As for the Jews, the people who possess the art of adaptability par excellence, this train of thought suggests immediately that one might see them virtually as a world historical arrangement for the production of actors, a veritable breeding ground for actors. And it is really high time to ask, what good actor today is not a Jew? The Jew, as a born man of letters, as the true master of the European press, also exercises his power by virtue of his histrionic gifts. For the man of letters is essentially an actor. He plays the, quote, expert, the specialist. Finally, women reflect on the whole history of women. Do they not have to be, first of all and above all else, actresses? Listen to physicians who have hypnotized women. Finally, love them. Let yourself be, quote, hypnotized by them. What is always the end result? That they, quote, put on something, even when they take off everything. Woman is so artistic, end quote. So, yes, Nietzsche says some sexist things here and some racist things here, although as per usual, his comments on the Jews, even when he makes generalizations about them, always have some kind of element of admiration. But, you know, we know all that. Nietzsche's a man of the 19th century. He's a reactionary on many issues. It's not really important. The interesting thought in this passage is, for one, the connection between the artist and the actor. And, of course, he puts artist in scare quotes. Later, we can get an intimation of what he means by this, where he's talking about a sort of, because he uses the artist in scare quotes later in the passage where he says, he's talking about people of families of the lower classes who have had to learn to adapt and survive. This generates the actor, the quote-unquote artist. The zany, the teller of lies, the buffoon, the fool, clown, and the classical servant, Gil Blas. Gil Blas, this is a play about somebody from a humble, low-born family who sets out on his own as a young man and eventually becomes wealthy and powerful. So Nietzsche, I think, is talking about artists in general, but he's talking about somebody who's able to, well, make art out of their life to some extent. And the reason why the actor and the artist are correlated in this specific context, think about what Nietzsche said in the first passage we looked at this time. Where nature ceases and becomes art. What is he talking about? When people become a nation of actors, when they can pick up and put down roles at their will, roles that they do identify with, but which nevertheless are no longer fixed and determinate, but something which one chooses for oneself and experiments with oneself. And again, Nietzsche says we can't really build a society anymore in the old sense, because that was based on these inflexible relations, social relations, these roles that you had to accept as a vocation, or rather these divine interpretations of your life path as something ordained by God's plan. And we should remember that we should keep in mind that he wasn't saying this, for one, as strictly something negative, because he compares it to Periclean Athens. Even if at an advanced stage, it turns you into a whole nation of actors, a whole nation of histrionics. And it's also not something that can be reversed, and it's not something that we can just sort of will ourselves that this not be the case. These are the conditions. This is what modern life is. This is the kind of person that it is bringing up. But the reason why I think this can also be generalized to art itself, art in the sense of like literal artists, not just people who make art out of their lives, is Nietzsche's talking here about falseness with a good conscience, the delight in simulation, flooding one's character and extinguishing it, the inner craving for a role in a mask, for appearance. Again, it would be hard to say that Nietzsche is disapproving of all of this, of the actor and the artist. given the way that he speaks about art and the goodwill toward appearance that he celebrates in the ancient Greeks, and the power of the artist, the power to falsify in order to establish orders of rank and legislate values and compel the will in new ways. This is a kind of power. And what's interesting in this passage, so 2 sections ago, we looked at the person who's not really of the lower classes or the oppressed classes, the person with no privilege, but the person who is themselves inadequate and has just enough education and privilege to see just how inadequate they are, just how mediocre they are, and how they really become the vessels for the most zealous type of moralistic revenge, morality cover as a sheen covering over the will for revenge. And it's interesting here, we get another change of vantage point, because who are we talking about? The lower classes, women, and the Jews. Nietzsche normally speaks favorably of the Jews. He normally speaks unfavorably of the lower classes and women, but the Jews are often used as an example in Nietzsche's writings of people who are marginalized. And they're sort of like an example of how a people who is marginalized can turn that to their advantage in a rather admirable way. And he, of course, admires the great geniuses of Jewish culture, such as Spinoza, and indeed Jesus Christ would be counted among those. It's funny, even what he says about genius here can be related to the previous passage, the one just before this one. Genius, if we cross-reference it with what Nietzsche says about it in Human All Too Human, specifically about artistic genius, we tend to see genius as this thing that is somewhat mysterious, that erupts spontaneously. And it is in Human All Too Human that he takes issue with this. He says that genius doesn't simply erupt, that the artist actually, in a way, is a bit of an actor himself, is putting up a false front, not just in terms of the art he creates, but in terms of his own character, where artists like to sort of mystify the process and act as if their ideas just are pulled out of the ether. They're whispered to him by the muse, when in fact there's a great deal of intentionality in the arts, and there's something that is built up for a long time, that artists labor over their work, they pour themselves into it, and often it's a long process within themselves of training and gathering experiences and this whole history of the soul. And so the creation of art should be regarded as a more gradual process. And perhaps the burst of genius is that proximal cause, like the match striking dynamite or something like this. And so this is where I think where he talks about the artist and even the quote-unquote genius. In this context, it has a sense to it, because the genius, the projection of genius, of this kind of spontaneous artistic inspiration, is itself a kind of pose, is itself a kind of acting that the artist does. But to return to the 3 kind of groups that Nietzsche talks about here, the part that's surprising, and that's kind of a different vantage point, is that in light of all of this, women and the lower classes are presented in somewhat, I won't say admiring or laudatory terms necessarily, but in a way that recognizes the power that these people have in the domain of acting, and given that acting is now the coin of the realm in, I was about to say society, but that's impossible to create, right? In European civilization currently, as Nietzsche sees it. And diplomats, that's a wonderful example, right? These are the jobs of the highest prestige, are these like government positions and roles as ministers or bureaucrats. And the whole business world would be another example. But life in institutions, life in politics, life in business, that all requires that you be a good actor. You're always putting up a false face. You're always engaging in false pleasantries. You're always trying to, if you're being a good salesman, that means you have to be a good actor. You have to be able to use or employ those histrionic skills to some extent. You have to be able to play on people's emotions and desires and fears and hopes, and to do so skillfully and to do so rhetorically. And diplomats would be free to become a good stage actor if he wished, if only he were free, because of course Nietzsche would think of such types as bound spirits, but what he's pointing out is it's exactly the same skill set. And so does, being a person of the lower classes afford you a greater advantage because of the adaptability you've had to cultivate. And that, the same reasoning could apply to the Jews as it could to women. That those who, this goes all the way back to Untruth and Lies in the Non-Moral Sense, of just the way Nietzsche sees things, is that the weaker party in terms of naked force, because of course historically men have more, physical, more political power than women, and physically are more powerful than women, and the Jews are a marginalized group of people. So those who can't just simply use naked force to get what they want have to defer to tactics like dissimulation, putting up a false front. Essentially, they have to become good actors. And will not those types of people thrive in these new conditions? So in a way, you could see this as a celebration of the power of the lower classes, of those who have been denied combat with fangs and sharp teeth and claws, to be in the best position to develop the intellect's greatest power. Now, of course, on the other side of that coin, Nietzsche also says, the artist has been treated with unpardonable generosity. And, this is certainly true culturally. It's probably true of Nietzsche himself. He's treated the artist with a great deal. He's lavished praise on the artist. He's also always raised the problem of the artist, and he certainly raises it here. And so you could also take it as a criticism of all of these groups. Again, as I said earlier in this read-through, the simple for or against I don't think is of really the highest concern here. What's more interesting is, to me at least, is the dynamic that Nietzsche is drawing out. Let's go to 362, quote, "Our faith that Europe will become more virile. We owe it to Napoleon, and not by any means to the French Revolution, which aimed at the, quote, brotherhood of nations and a blooming universal exchange of hearts, that we now confront a succession of a few warlike centuries that have no parallel in history. In short, that we have entered the classical age of war, of scientific and at the same time popular war on the largest scale, in weapons, talents, and discipline. All coming centuries will look back on it with envy and awe for its perfection, for the national movement out of which this war glory is growing is only the countershock against Napoleon, and would not exist except for Napoleon. He should receive credit someday for the fact that in Europe the man has again become master over the businessman and the Philistine, and perhaps even over woman who has been pampered by Christianity and the enthusiastic spirit of the 18th century, and even more by, quote, modern ideas. Napoleon, who considered modern ideas and civilization itself almost as a personal enemy, proved himself through this enmity as one of the greatest continuators of the Renaissance. He brought back, again, a whole slab of antiquity, perhaps even the decisive peace, the peace of granite. And who knows whether this slab of antiquity might not finally become master again over the national movement, or whether it must not become the heir and continuator of Napoleon in an affirmative sense. For what he wanted was one unified Europe, as is known, as mistress of the earth." End quote. So our faith that Europe will become more virile, literally more manly, virility, right? The word for virtue in Roman, vir, comes from man. So the virtue, to be virtuous is to be manly in some sense. And so the idea that, Nietzsche's talked about this before, that the French Revolution, the kind of redemption of it is the fact that it produces Napoleon. It's actually the ideals of the French Revolution Nietzsche takes great issue with, but unlike many of the other commenters on the French Revolution, he sees, as he says in Human All Too Human, all the fire and blood surrounding the revolution and the renewed vigor and warfare to actually be a saving grace, and then the fact is that it produces Napoleon, this man who wants a united Europe, under his reign as emperor, of course. And so we have that sort of echo of a figure like Caesar or Alcibiades, who is a conqueror, an artist on the level of statecraft, an artist on the level of warfare. Napoleon's one of the most successful and the most apt generals of all time, and there's actually a measurable difference whether Napoleon is there commanding on the battlefield or not, in terms of whether or not the battle is won. He's one of the most, just by the numbers, effective commanders in history. And so he's a kind of artist. He creates an empire for himself. And like with Alexander and like with Caesar's reign, of course, it doesn't last. But he wasn't really aimed at, he didn't do any, this is Nietzsche's interpretation here, he didn't do anything that he did for the sake of the people. He wasn't trying to create something to leave for them. He wasn't doing it as, that would be perhaps the utilitarian view, or like the view that might come from modern ideas, and even a lot of versions of great man theory, a la Thomas Carlyle, that we should be thankful to the great men and that they are our great benefactors and patrons. Nietzsche would say, no, they only cared about themselves. Now, do they nevertheless benefit humanity? Yes, but this is like Nietzsche's entire somewhat paradoxical position in The Gay Science about what advances the species, that it is people who are acting from totally selfish, totally egotistic drives. That in and of itself advances the species. That in and of itself, in the case of Napoleon, is what creates these national movements. We see the birth of nationalism that grows out, and this desire for war glory that grows out of these countershocks against Napoleon. What does this mean? Well, he destroys the old Holy Roman Empire. He subjugates and subordinates pretty much all these old ailing imperial dynasties on the continent to his will. And out of this, we get like the German War of Liberation, for example, where you for the first time have this sense of, no, we are actually Germans. And there's all these other effects of Napoleon, of creating the modern French state, and indeed many of the model for the modern state institutions, and then, of course, also this intimation of the possibility of a united Europe, of one continental Europe. And, of course, Napoleon is most powerfully opposed by the British, who are always against either France or Germany, who are both perpetually trying to do this, reigning supreme over the continent and marginalizing Britain. And they always are by the skin of their teeth in the modern age, managing to inveigle and prevent this from happening, taking the correct sides in these webs of alliances in order to prevent that there should ever be too powerful of a German empire, for example, or and indeed defeating Napoleon and putting an end to this continental system that he was establishing. Of course, and so Kaufman is quick to point out Nietzsche seems to be celebrating nationalism here, but what he's really celebrating is the energy beneath nationalism, and the idea that Napoleon, we might say, advanced. He turned the wheel of history, right? He brought things to a new, I don't want to say phase of development, because that sounds Hegelian, and I don't think Nietzsche thinks of things in those terms. But we might say that, yes, like the development of nationalism and all of these things, even though Nietzsche is usually opposed to nationalism, or is like, he's definitely opposed to it, for example, in Germany. So the passage earlier, where he's making fun of Deutschland über alles. But nevertheless, the energy beneath that, he thinks, has some sort of potential. And the idea that, like so many of the things of the modern world are bound up in nationalism. In other words, that there's much to criticize about modernity and its ideas. Obviously, Nietzsche criticizes all of that. But he's also a realist in a profound sense. That is the world that you have to confront. And many things that are now possible, many opportunities exist because of those developments, that the shift to this new phase in European political life that were not possible before. And we can always be grateful for things of that nature. And so, but the thrust of the passage, right? The French were aimed at brotherhood of nations, a blooming universal exchange of hearts. In many ways, the French Revolution is just a continuation of Christianity. Napoleon is a continuer of the Renaissance, of the spirit of the Renaissance, which was a resurgence of the values of pagan antiquity, as we've talked about earlier in this read-through. And here he makes it explicit. Napoleon brings back a whole slab of antiquity, perhaps even the decisive piece, the piece of granite, the foundations of the antiquity. What were the foundations of the spirit of antiquity? Well, Alexander, Caesar, Alcibiades. At least in Nietzsche's view at this time in his career, that's who he sees. And that's what Napoleon is a resurgence of the spirit of. And really, I think why Nietzsche is so attracted to this is because the man has become, again, the master over the businessman and the Philistine, maybe even over women again. So the society of actors, right, of diplomats and bureaucrats and businessmen and, as he says here, women, Philistines, so that would be like the midwit, the mediocre midwit, the vindictive moralist, would be included in that category. The significance of Napoleon is that he it represents a return to the fighting aristocrat, as the highest type. And that really to Nietzsche is the spirit of antiquity. Force against force, and honesty that it is force against force, and an almost cheerful disregard of moral fictions, as we see, for example, in the Melian dialogue of Thucydides. That's what Napoleon is bringing back to some extent. Now, is Nietzsche right about this? I mean, as he says, where the coming centuries will look back on his age with envy and awe for its perfection, the classical age of war. Well, of course, the next century would actually be the age for the first half of great wars, and then those give rise to the long peace, to the end of history. So Nietzsche might not be as prescient here as he is in some other places. And did Napoleon really bring back the foundations of antiquity? I mean, even within the logic of Nietzschean philosophy more broadly, we could take issue with this, because you could say the great man, so to speak, is always a lightning strike. The extraordinary specimen, the extraordinary person, is always a rare event in any age. And the point, at least that I've gleaned from broader Nietzschean philosophy, is that it's the exception that always drives forward the species, as we've said. Now, it's arbitrary to say what it means to advance the species, of course, but that's our task as conscious beings, is to fix a value on nature. And so does Napoleon bring that back, or is he just the most late-coming example of a kind of political genius? The other thing is Nietzsche's also just put genius in scare quotes, and we've talked about how he's been critical of the concept of genius, and then here he's speaking of Napoleon as this kind of military genius, or genius of statecraft here, at least implicitly. He doesn't really use that term. But, is Napoleon was he really the cause, or was he just the match that was struck? So there's all sorts of ways to be critical of a passage like this, not least of which is, that you could take it as just a naked endorsement or advocacy for a kind of modern Caesarism as a solution to the fact that we are becoming a civilization of actors. And Napoleon is against civilization itself and against modern ideas. And so is that the solution? And at times in Nietzsche's work, it seems as though it is. At other times, Nietzsche is, I think he goes through different mental states where in different states of mind, he seems as though he's willing to go to war to the death with modernity, and at other times he's much more accepting of the situation as it is and trying to look for a kind of sublation or a way through it. And at least for my part, that's always been more of the Nietzsche that I'm more of a fan of. But what he says here is at least interesting, again, as just yet another perspective that he's giving us here in Book 5. And so let's, with that, we're going to look at one final aphorism today, or one final section. This is 363. Quote, "How each sex has its own prejudice about love. Despite all the concessions that I'm willing to make to the prejudice in favor of monogamy, I will never admit the claim that man and woman have equal rights in love. These do not exist. For man and woman have different conceptions of love, and it is one of the conditions of love in both sexes that neither sex presupposes the same feeling and same concept of love in the other. What woman means by love is clear enough: total devotion, not mere surrender, with soul and body, without any consideration or reserve, rather with shame and horror at the thought of a devotion that might be subject to special clauses or conditions. In this absence of conditions, her love is a faith. Woman has no other faith. Man, when he loves a woman, wants precisely this love from her, and is thus himself as far as can be from the presupposition of feminine love. Supposing, however, that there should also be men to whom the desire for total devotion is not alien, well, then they simply are not men. A man who loves like a woman becomes a slave, while a woman who loves like a woman becomes a more perfect woman. A woman's passion and its unconditional renunciation of rights of her own presupposes precisely that on the other side there is no equal pathos, no equal will to renunciation. For if both parties felt impelled by love to renounce themselves, we should then get, I do not know what, perhaps an empty space? Woman wants to be taken and accepted as a possession, wants to be absorbed into the concept of possession, possessed. Consequently, she wants someone who takes, who does not give himself or give himself away. On the contrary, he is supposed to become richer in himself through the accretion of strength, happiness, and faith given him by the woman who gives herself. Woman gives herself away, man acquires more. I do not see how one can get around this natural opposition by means of social contracts or with the best will in the world to be just, desirable as it may be, not to remind oneself constantly how harsh, terrible, enigmatic, and immoral this antagonism is. For love, thought of in its entirety as great and full, is nature, and being nature, it is in all eternity something, quote, immoral. Faithfulness is accordingly included in woman's love. It follows from the definition. In man, it can easily develop in the wake of his love, perhaps as gratitude or as an idiosyncratic taste and so-called elective affinity, but it is not an essential element of his love, so definitely not that one might almost speak with some justification of a natural counterplay of love and faithfulness in man. For his love consists of wanting to have, and not of renunciation and giving away, but wanting to have always comes to end with having. It is actually man's more refined and suspicious lust for possession that rarely admits his, quote, having, and then only late, and thus permits his love to persist. It is even possible for his love to increase after the surrender. He will not readily concede that a woman should have nothing more to give him, end quote. Yeah, it's, one of those passages on women, which again, the caveat here is listening to Nietzsche's opinion on love and relationships is a bit crazy because he was totally unsuccessful in these things. So, he's not really a guru you should look to on this because he's rather unqualified. But it's interesting that, the way that he talks about each sex having their prejudice about love, it's at least interesting to consider the possibility. Do both sexes, if the male and female brain are different, are they going to have different conceptions of love? Probably. And probably is. Anyone who's been in a long-term relationship will know that. Will know that there are just different ways that men and women tend to think about things that can lead to endless misunderstandings and fights and things like this. And you learn to adapt to those things and sometimes and even appreciate them. So there's like a seed of an idea there that's kind of interesting. The other thing is that the way Nietzsche is describing men and women, we can compare to the Greek concept of the lover and the beloved. Of course, this often was applied in Greek discourse to relationships between men, but we know Nietzsche was familiar with all of those texts, and so it is interesting that he's talking about the woman as the lover and the man as the beloved. It's a power imbalance. It's an unequal relationship, the lover and the beloved. And this is actually kind of borne out by modern psychological research, as far as I'm aware, that in most relationships, we tend to think that, our love should be equal, but one person is kind of crazier about the other person. And very rarely is there an equal level of enthusiasm between partners. And this is it's fine. It's not as if the other person doesn't love the other person at all, but there's usually a kind of imbalance. And Nietzsche is mapping that on to male and female in a way where one person is the possession, the other one takes possession. He rightly points out that these are completely mutually exclusive concepts. You can't both renounce yourselves to the other, or there would be an empty space remaining. I guess it just, the question is whether or not that's actually describes the way all men and all women think about love. Of course, Nietzsche just puts it categorically. If a man wants to surrender himself, if a man wants to renounce himself, then he's just not a man. So it's true by definition, according to the way Nietzsche's talking about it here. But I guess the interesting thing is that, it's funny because Nietzsche says, I don't know how one can get around this natural opposition by means of social contracts or with the best will in the world. How harsh, terrible, enigmatic, and immoral this antagonism is. Love is is part of nature, and being nature, it's in all eternity something immoral. And so that's probably one of the most interesting concepts here, is that Nietzsche makes this whole conception about the man as the possessor and the woman as she who wants to be possessed. And much of the passage is just a reiteration of this central theme. And yet there's an interesting, insight at the end of it. It's let's assume for a second that that's true. Nietzsche makes it clear, that would be immoral, but that's nature. Life, nature, and history are thoroughly immoral. And the idea that, love, relationships of like genuine love, not the Christian falsifications of love or love as a moral duty or any of these things. Love for all mankind. What is that? An abstraction that doesn't even exist. Love for something that doesn't exist. Love for a concept. Love for God, which is, something in the imagination. And but in real love, when there is this interplay of someone who is willing to be possessed and someone who wants to take possession, if indeed that's what love is, then it would always be an unequal relation. It would always be an unjust relation. There would always be, as Nietzsche says in Beyond Good and Evil, there's always a tyrannical feeling involved with love. And so there's just so much about it that will forever resist our moral judgments. Everything about biology, essentially, will always resist our moral judgments. And at least the way Nietzsche presents it here is that, I'm not telling you this. I'm not prescribing this. I'm diagnosing this. This is how it is. This is how the sexes relate to each other. It's thoroughly unjust, but of course it is. It's nature. It's biology. And your morality can't touch it. You can only cover it over. So again, is Nietzsche correct in what he says about women in this passage? I wouldn't listen to Nietzsche on that front because he didn't know what he was talking about. But how is he to say any of this? He was never married. He was never in a serious relationship at all, from what we know. He might have had some trysts, possibly. He was definitely friends with many women. But the relationships that he had with those women were not this relationship of lover and beloved. Nietzsche never possessed a woman. Does that mean that he can't have a psychological insight? No, it doesn't mean that, but it just means he's not really a trustworthy source on this. But perhaps the notion that, we have to keep in mind there are different conceptions of just different ways of thinking, depending on sex, about everything that can often clash. And perhaps more interestingly, just the notion that even when it comes to something like love, that we tend to conceptualize, again, in these abstract terms, or in Christian terms, or in moral terms, the reality of love, the reality of lust, of the sexual drive, of the infatuation with another person, and the desire to possess, which I think can be found no matter what your sex is. Real love, natural love, physiological love, the biological basis of love is all thoroughly immoral. It's all thoroughly unjust. And it's just funny how when we put a moral sheen on love, we turn it into this other thing. We falsify it. And that to me is the interesting insight in this passage primarily. But that's going to do it for this week. Thank you very much for joining me, and hopefully you will be back next week. Join me then as we continue through the Gay Science Book 5. We're coming very close to the end now. See you next time. Cheers. Amor Fati, signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.